Welcome to Perspectives, the vodcast of the American Mental Health Counselors Association with the National President and Interim CEO/ED, Dr. Beverly Smith. This vodcast will bring to you the perspectives of clinical mental health counseling as it pertains to ethics, public policy and legislation, multiculturalism and social justice, as well as leadership and advocacy. This vodcast will feature experts in the clinical mental health counseling field to enhance the work of clinical professionals and to inform the public. The American Mental Health Counselors Association advocates for over 130,000 licensed clinical mental health counselors in the United States who are licensed to assess, diagnose, and treat mental disorders. We are the only organization working exclusively for clinical mental health counselors. Join the Perspectives for insight from experts on wellness and daily living, current clinical research, integrative healthcare, as well as how to maintain personal, family, and organizational wellness in an anxious and ever-changing world. Let's connect and hear the perspectives.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives. I'm Dr. Beverly Smith. I'm the president of the American Mental Health Counselors Association. This evening, I have the pleasure of bringing to Perspectives Dr. Lee Tufo-Prada. She's coming to us from Northwestern University. She has a wealth of knowledge and has been a leading expert during COVID-19 as it relates to mental health care, homeschooling, children, and clinical mental health training. And so I want to now give Dr. Lee an opportunity to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the warm welcome and introduction. As you shared, I'm with Northwestern University, the Family Institute, and specifically I'm their Associate Program Director. And it's really an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to the mental health challenges children and families are currently experiencing and have experienced during the pandemic, and also the inherent challenges that students during the pandemic have experienced in clinical training. So thank you so much.
Glad that you are here, Dr. Lee. Before we get into the depth of our podcast, tell us a little bit more about your experience, your journey. What led you to Northwestern? I read in your bio, you have over 15 years of experience in counseling education. You are a strategic thinker and equitable solution finder. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Oh, thank you. I think I learned early on in my master's degree, which I did at Ohio University, that the more you learn, the less you know. Mm-hmm. And that really has been a guiding principle for me in my time as a counselor and a counselor educator. And with that idea that I want to continue to learn and grow and develop, I've realized there's a lot of things I just don't know. And I want to know more and more types of things. And so that led me to really invest in my education and pursue supporting children and families that are in crisis, or children specifically that are experiencing trauma, what have you. And it was a natural fit to join Northwestern and specifically the Family Institute. Their very mission is supporting children, families, various systems that impact children and families and couples. And when I really found out about that particular program and their work with Northwestern at large, it was hard to not want to be part of their organization, excuse me. And I was able to join. And from that point forward, I think really my research and my scholarship expanded quite exponentially. And some of it probably was because it was Northwestern, and I definitely wanted to do them proud. I think the other thing was that it was a bit of a pivotal moment in our country and in what was going on for so many folks across the country. Worldwide social and racial injustice, really watching children struggle with mental health for years and then really get it to a point that it's like a breaking point. Mm-hmm. I felt, again, that voice in my mind saying, Lee, you just don't know enough about this. Go find more, go research more, do more, get this out. And Northwestern and the Family Institute really allowed me to do that. You know, they lean into us promoting those types of things and investigating that. And because I'm surrounded by such wonderful colleagues, everybody kind of joined in. It wasn't something almost like the vaccines, right? I think sometimes folks are wondering, like, did this happen just yesterday? For me personally, no, it didn't happen even just in this last 2 years with the pandemic. This is something that I've been really committed to for at least 10 years. Again, supporting children, supporting families, supporting communities that are in crisis and are experiencing trauma. It just hit a fever's pitch, I think, in the last 2 years.
Okay. You mentioned a quote. You said, the more you learn, the less you know. How has that come to the forefront during COVID-19 and the work that you do?
Oh my goodness. It feels like this idea that, like, you learn that children are going to be impacted by COVID.
Mhm.
So you uncover that and you're like, oh my goodness, it's not just a mental health impact or a physical impact. It's a systemic impact. It's a societal impact. So every time you're uncovering one thing, it feels like that thread of things to learn gets deeper and deeper. Personally, I felt like I was at a place of cultural and diversity and inclusive competence. But then you get into the time of George Floyd's murder and watching the BIPOC community really be heavily impacted by education loss and being disproportionately impacted by COVID. And again, it's one thing after the next. The things that you don't know become exponential in that moment. And I really, again, tried to commit and lean into the fact that you're not going to know it all, but you're going to need to keep investigating and uncovering those truths so maybe you can impact some change.
So you have this enlightenment. What about other colleagues and professionals who do not have this enlightenment and do not embrace diversity during this pivotal time in our country? What advice would you lend to those individuals and for those who work with those individuals?
That's a great question. My first response is I'm a truth teller. So I'm going to tell you the truth and I'm going to speak it loud and proud. And but to do that from a place of compassion and kindness. But I'm not going to let my foot off the gas. So I think in those moments, it's important to acknowledge and validate that maybe somebody else isn't in the, like you said, the enlightenment or the place that you are, but not to soft pedal, not to back off. It's okay for other people to feel uncomfortable. It's okay for there to be a moment of rupture, so long as both individuals or communities are open to the idea of repair and growth. And so I think ultimately that's what I'm bringing to the table is I'm a truth teller. I'm going to lean into
I like that.
Yeah, I'm going to lean into those difficult conversations. And hopefully as counselors, counselor educators, clinicians, we're modeling that for the next generation, that we walked in that uncomfortableness, right? So that's almost the best you can do, or at least that's the best I can do.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate you saying, that you are a truth teller and that it is okay to be uncomfortable and for people to be uncomfortable.
Right.
I think oftentimes we understand the theoretical piece of that as we practice and serve as counselors, as therapists, psychotherapists, whatever the title we use, we understand that it's okay to be in silence. It's okay for our students or our clients, our patients, to be uncomfortable. But when the tables are turned, right? When they're turned and we are now the ones who are uncomfortable, that then looks and feels differently for mental health professionals who are struggling with embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we've been in an era whereas I think now that embracing has been synonymous to having webinars, doing things of that nature. And that is a part of it. But there's also another step, research, the training, the policy, legislation. Those are things that we have to address. And so what are your thoughts to moving forward, to addressing those issues, to getting beyond the webinars, getting beyond Zoom when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I really appreciate the question. I think it's important to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And so I think in the moment where folks lean on their laurels and think, oh, well, I'm competent, I'm doing X, Y, or Z, that's the moment it should be an alarm bell for folks that you're not doing enough. That you need to seek out opportunities to continue, like I said, grow and develop, learn more. And if that's going on for you and it's starting to feel complacent or comfortable, what's the next aspect? Like you said, let's do some research. Let's get our voice out there. Let's try to maybe, shift some folks' development, mental lens, or wherever they're at in a moment in time. So again, get comfortable with the uncomfortable and really, really, really have checks and balances in that. So if you have a colleague, someone like yourself, or someone that you're in practice with, lean into that idea that someone else is going to catch you on you becoming complacent or becoming comfortable. And I think that's going to look different for everybody, to be honest with you. For me, it looked like I did a lot kind of on the micro or the meso layer of advocacy, but I was scared to take it to a larger audience, what have you. A couple people called me out on that and they were like, come on, Lee, you've got some good things going here. You're doing some good kind of grassroots work. What's the next step? And I had to, get comfortable with this idea that it's scary. It's scary to lean into the things that are new for you. And for me, it was really putting my voice out there in a book or in a national forum. But that was good. It was good to be uncomfortable with that and lean into it.
And thank you for your transparency and saying, hey, someone said, hey, you can do more, go further. So I thank you for that. And I think we do need that accountability. We need that push. And there are individuals who look at us and say, hey, you're doing a great job. You're advocating. I see you have the talent to take it to the next level.
Right.
And so we need that. We need that type of advocacy and that push for continued advocacy. So thank you for being transparent in that. I appreciate it. And so we talk about diversity, COVID-19. We shift and talk about how has it impacted the family? How has it impacted children, whether it's K through 12 or college age? What are your thoughts on the impact of mental health care for the family, for children, for teenagers, for college students?
I appreciate that question. Again, that was that moment for me a couple of years ago, right as the pandemic was starting to happen, and having worked with children and diverse children and children that were in crisis and families that were in crisis for years, I really paused and thought, my goodness, it's just amazing to me that no one is speaking up and talking about what this is doing to our children of color, our single moms, people in different socioeconomic status. And it was like an aha moment for me that you're seeing these large news articles about the American Pediatric Society is saying across the board, unequivocally, kids need to go back to school, that's the safest place for them. Mm-hmm. And it really struck me that for some people, that's not their safe place. Mm-hmm. It's just not. And then there's other communities where going to school is the only place they get a good meal, or that's the only way their parents can work. And so it felt like a really one-note message. While the mass of society may agree with this idea that children are better off in school, they've missed all the communities and all the sublayers that have so much more going on than just going to school. They're being discriminated at school, or they're being hurt in their home. Or again, it's a much more layered conversation than let's get kids back to school or they can survive this. And then again, the more you learn about that, and then you find under that this idea that even in school, children are experiencing worry. They have family members that have gotten ill with COVID or even died. So in that moment, it was like Pandora's box. Like there couldn't have been enough issues to really address at that moment, which is, let's hear all these multiple perspectives about what a child's experience in a school is like. what is a child's experience right now, managing the pandemic, and all the diverse communities that interact with these large systems. Need to hear those voices, and again, kind of teasing that out. And so really what I have seen is a lot of one-note messages, kind of blanket statements about education or blanket statements about mental health. And I really would like to encourage folks to get into the nuance. Is what does that look for a child that is diverse, or for a child that is part of a community that it doesn't have as many economic resources as the majority. So again, pulling that curtain back and being like, how does this actually apply to the communities and the children that I am working with? Very different answers. And I think then that will inform our treatment, our advocacy, our work with these children and with these families, because then we'll be able to see them for who they are and how they have interacted with something that I don't think we'll ever get over in our lifetime.
And that's a good point. And I honestly agree with you. I don't think we're going to get over it anytime soon, and maybe not again in our lifetime. But it's been unfortunate that the approach was taken of, as you mentioned, that one note approach. Send the students back to school and they will survive it. Well, guess what? Yeah, they're surviving it, but limping while they're doing it, falling down while they're doing it, and not to mention maybe the trauma that they had experienced on the front end. So now COVID-19 is kind of it's another layer. It's another source of trauma. And
I think it's the great amplifier. I think it amplifies, right, the existing disparities, the existing discomfort, the existing challenges that were there. So one of the motivators for the work that I did in the writing I did around homeschooling and mental health was ultimately that even before the pandemic, our BIPOC community was the largest increase in homeschooling ever.
Oh, wow.
So our BIPOC families, our BIPOC children were leaving traditional education in droves even before the pandemic. So what does that say about the education system for folks that are diverse? It says it's not necessarily as safe as we would like to think it is. You amplify that with a pandemic experience, children that are African American, Latinx, their parents are disproportionately impacted by COVID. So it amplifies this. Is it safe? Is this what I ultimately, where I'm going to get my needs met? By and large, those communities are saying, no, it doesn't feel safe for my child. I have a lot of question marks about what this is going to look like for my child. So it has amplified already known challenges. The only silver lining in this is that folks are now somewhat savvy to that. They can see other things as options, and folks are finally speaking up around what that looks like for children and what it looks like for families that aren't your stereotypic in the box norm. I think that's exciting, but it ultimately, again, it really amplified things that we already knew to be true.
And I agree with that, but you mentioned something was really important. You mentioned some few words of feeling safe, secure. Is that possible right now for individuals of color, minority groups who have seen the George Floyd, who have seen Bland, who've seen the televised brutality over the past few years, and now we have COVID-19, and with experiencing inequity during this process, and again, as you said, it was amplified. So with all of that compound, how do individuals, communities, educators, I'm not sure which one, there's a lot I could throw out, how do we find our way back to safe and secure just for basic functionalities of the day?
So again, another phenomenal question. I think first is acknowledging the realities of what these communities are dealing with. I think it's no longer a secret. It's the truth. Again, truth telling. When we talk about even right now, kids being back in school, everybody's back in school, or children are back to getting their mental health services, or, mom and dad are back to work. That doesn't apply to everyone, right? It doesn't apply. It applies if you are in a prestigious group, right? If you have a mom or dad that's able to be full-time employed, if you have the financial resources to have a good mask, or to be in a school district that is making the adjustments to ensure children's safety. Again, that doesn't apply to large groups of folks. So when you're asking a community of folks that are either impacted by their diversity, by their culture, by their socioeconomic status, by their gender, by their sexual orientation, it's a whole nother set of rules and layers to account for. I think there needs to be a reckoning around that, which is naming that ultimately these groups of folks have been disproportionately impacted during the pandemic, but even before. And so once that truth is told, those realities are known and accepted, which I think is a lot of the work that we're really embroiled in right now, is getting a true sense of the depth of the challenge, is to then ultimately respond in a way that is equitable and inclusive. So if you're going to say bring kids back to school, and there are groups of folks that don't feel safe, we need to take steps to ultimately make that equitable or make that inclusive in that moment. And I don't think that school districts they're inundated with this idea of safety, but they haven't gone the layer deeper, or the layer deeper after that, to ultimately identify what that's going to look like for a child that isn't essentially in the white privileged socioeconomically high status group.
That's true. And I think collectively we normalize everything, or make going back to a building or school synonymous with being safe and healthy. And that does not always correlate where we are now. Send them back to school, put them back in school. That somehow makes it normal, and it wipes away the experiences and the things that they have experienced or seen or been involved or engaged in. It doesn't work like that when you talk about the mental health of a family, of an individual, and of the workers, quite frankly. It's just not that easy.
Most definitely. And so I think, again, naming the known realities and then how can we equitably address it is really important. I do think there are silver linings in this concept of children returning to school, or returning to some societal norms or community services, because a lot of outreach stopped, or a lot of those services kind of stopped during the pandemic. So I do think some of the lining is that those services have restarted. But it begs the question, were they good enough to begin with? It's like, okay, we're going to return to what we were doing before for children that have had trauma, or children that have had an abuse history or what have you, or children that don't have the economic resources. Yeah, great, we've returned some of those services back, but I don't think we were even there to begin with. And so I'm glad that people are getting at least something, but I think, at this point, people are calling BS on it, and they're saying this isn't enough. That's just not enough for what our community and our children need.
I like it. You call it as you see it, and you don't hold back. So I love that. And I think we need more of that. That is a part of advocacy that I think maybe we need to hear and see more of in the profession. And so thank you for giving voice to that. Tell us more about homeschooling and about your work and research as it relates to homeschooling, the pandemic, diversity. Tell us more.
Oh, I appreciate that. Homeschooling was trending up like 3%, 5% year over year since the 1980s, early 1980s. Every year, less and less people are in our public schools and private schools, and more people are engaging in homeschooling. And so again, that speaks to the systemic nature of the challenges that folks are experiencing for their children. Is especially prevalent, again, in certain groups. And the groups would be our BIPOC community, children that have been diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder, children that have experienced some type of trauma in school. The number one reason why parents choose to homeschool is the environment. So if you open up this idea of the parent not being satisfied or in alignment with the environment that a child is in, the majority of their young lives, parents are making the choice to opt out of that, which is, again, prior to the pandemic and even now, school violence prompted a lot of parents throughout the 80s and 90s to ultimately say this doesn't feel like a safe place. There's increased, again, gun violence or bullying, discrimination, you name it, in regards to the environment of a school. People are leaving in the droves. It was estimated that prior to the pandemic that upwards of 40% of parents were considering homeschooling their children long-term, either as a result of the pandemic or the things they learned because of the pandemic, which was, my child feels safer at home, or my goodness, I don't have to worry anymore about a gun being shown in a school. So those types of things have, again, only amplified the exodus from traditional schooling. It's also become more widely societally accepted to homeschool a child. And parents, again, have really leaned into this idea, but it all centers around environment. And it also really correlates with specific groups or communities that have been disproportionately impacted by schools or by private institutions that, quite frankly, just haven't come forward to support those communities.
Okay. Now, what are your projections as far as future projections, as far as those who may desire or move to homeschooling?
I think it's only going to continue to increase. Some of the numbers that are coming out again is that we're still trending 5 to 7% folks are electing year over year to homeschool. And it's not like those numbers are equal on the public school or the private school side. It's not that numbers are increasing for public schools, either due to birth rate or due to improvement in school systems. They're just losing numbers. And so ultimately states and locales, even mental health providers, have really named this as an increasing population. And so behind that, I think we're going to continue to see legislation, services that really cater to an increasingly large population of children and families.
Okay. Now, how would that impact how we train? How would that impact counselor educators as we supervise students in the clinics, intern, practicum? What should we consider altering?
That's a great question. I think, again, naming it as a known population and really understanding the values, the culture, the identity of a homeschooler. There's a lot of inherent myths and biases out there about what a homeschooler looks like or about what a parent who homeschool looks like. The reality is they are diverse and mixed, as you would find in a public school or a private school. And so knowing what that population is about and helping ultimately dispel the myths associated with homeschoolers, I think will be an important first step for counselors, counselor educators, counselors in training. I guess my parallel to this is online education. You rewind 10, 15 years ago, it was taboo. Like nobody wanted anything to do with online education.
So let's get on into this. Yeah.
Right. So it was like, you're ruining your career if you head in that direction. Like, don't do online. Look at where we are now. There is not a university out there that doesn't offer some aspect of online education. It is now, in many respects, the norm. It's this, right? It's the same thing with telemental health. Taboo. Like, I heard many of people 10 years ago that didn't share that they saw clients online because they were concerned that they were going to be called out for doing something illegal or unethical. So ultimately, homeschool is in the same trajectory. we've now kind of opened this idea that children can be at home and they can be safe and they can learn. And again, I'm not talking about school at home, I'm talking about homeschooling. So it's one thing to just say, here's your iPad, good luck with that. That's not really homeschooling, that's school at home. And so I think there's a community of folks out there that once felt very taboo and felt kind of shrouded in myth, that it's become increasingly mainstream. And again, counselors, educators, if they can get behind this idea that telemental health became mainstream, online education became mainstream, I think they'll ultimately see the diversity and the potential in homeschooling. And if we were really to make it even more kind of multi-generational, this century, we've seen a lot of traditional schooling, but you rewind a century up until the 1920s, the vast majority of children were homeschooled. And if you go to other cultures, other nations, other parts of the world, homeschooling is still a cultural norm. And it's a very westernized idea that we have to be involved in this larger system to tell us how to behave.
That's true. And I'm glad you brought up about the myths and help to dispel some of those myths. It's just like dispelling the myths associated with mental health, period. We're still on that battlefield, if you will, but we've made progress. And so interesting, in the period and era that we're in at this point, telemental health is vital. It's almost vital to your existence and your mental health. It kind of serves two purposes, actually, because we maintain our connection with the outside world. We work through telemental health. We use Zoom and other platforms to help us still stay connected when we cannot physically do so. So that is important as well. You mentioned again about telemental health. So I'm assuming, and based on what you said, it's on the rise. And so more professionals, more counselors are embracing mental health. Telemental health. Do you think it's critical to maintain credentialing in telemental health, or just by nature of serving and working now through this pandemic that is enough?
Great question. I think it's a yes and. Yes, I think credentialing is important, and yes, I think ongoing continuing education in regards to it is important. I would say though, I don't think it's enough to say that you're credentialed or you took a continuing education. I think ultimately you need to, similar to what we all did in our masters, you need to do some, practice. You need to, really start to understand what you're jumping into. So I think it's a yes and. I think we should both, cultivate those experiences and those opportunities, but also encourage folks to continue to credential themselves or do some additional continuing education around it for sure.
I agree. And I've spoken with various colleagues, and some of them have stated that, I think telemental health should be part of our basic training. It should just become the standard of receiving the master's degree, or part of this requirement to being licensed for that basic entry level of licensure.
I couldn't agree more. Really, I couldn't agree more. We've really noticed in the counseling program that I help support is that the only way we would have survived the pandemic and been able to have students matriculate in a timely fashion was to allow, right, and embrace the idea of telemental health and telesupervision. I think it's continuing to be a growth edge though. I think a lot of people have this idea that we're going to accommodate just temporarily for the ongoing education of our future counselors, or even just for our clients, and that eventually we would tighten that back up again. I think that, again, the cat's out of the bag. We all know it's possible. We all know in many respects it's as good or better than some of the things that we've been doing historically face to face. So I'm seeing that across the country in some of the training sites. There are some states and locales that are continuing to be agreeable or amenable to this idea of ongoing telemental health for counselor training or for even licensed counselors. But then there is ultimately some prohibitions around that, which are, we now expect you to be face-to-face for supervision, or, so it's it's going to be interesting to see how this is going to play out state to state, locale to locale, of if they're going to try to kind of stuff us back into some of the previous ways in which we operated.
True. And you're right. So I'm interested myself to see how this play out, lack of a better word, what happens, how much progress do we make, will we make, and what impact of our progression to move forward, maintain where we are, or go backwards, what impact would that have on the profession and those that we serve and our students?
For sure, most definitely. I think some of the larger stakeholders in this will be insurance, Medicaid, Medicare. How much are they going to reimburse for it? And then ultimately, how much do our clients, right, and our counselors in training demand the services that they ultimately need and expect?
And that is very critical. Clients, patients, students, they have power that maybe they don't quite recognize. They have the power to demand what services that they can partake in. They have the power to say to the insurance company in various ways, if you don't hear the voice of the people from letter writing advocacy, there are other ways to say, hey, I want my voice to be heard. I would like to see these services, and don't penalize the therapist just because they are providing services in telemental health.
For sure.
Particularly when you talk about those who are in, the rural areas. But even if they're not in the rural areas and they're in a city, they still deserve the choice to be serviced in the best way that meets their lifestyle and their medical needs.
For sure. And I think ultimately people do want that choice, and they want the choice of matching with a therapist that's highly qualified when distance is no longer an issue. So, and again, students are really calling for it. We have a lot of students that ultimately really name that's one of the reasons they got into the profession, was that the profession was accelerating in expanding its reach. So I think we need to hear that call.
Okay. Any as we begin to wrap up, any final recommendations or thoughts as it relates to homeschooling, COVID-19, and diversity, the intersectionality of those? Any recommendations to counselor educators, students?
I really appreciate that. I would strongly encourage everyone to get to know a homeschooler, talk with your parents and children, how they're actually managing, right? How are you personally managing this? And what would that look like for somebody that's diverse or different than you?
Mm-hmm.
Because it then adds a layer of complexity and a layer of need that I would challenge each and every person listening to ultimately then get to learn more about that. Because there's a lot out there that I don't think we all fully know and appreciate, but we definitely have the opportunity to learn more about it.
That's true. That's true. And as far as the public, what would you say if you had an opportunity to say to parents or to the community at large, those who necessarily do not have a counselor educator background, what would you say to them as it relates to COVID-19, diversity, and homeschooling, that intersectionality?
I would say that children, we are going to be learning and hearing about the impact of COVID-19 for the remainder of our days. And if we want to turn a really, really challenging time in all of our lives into a positive, it would really be important to lean into what those children's needs are, what those family needs are, what the needs are of our BIPOC community, and how can we get out of this in a place where we say, you know what, this was a challenging time, but we've ultimately improved and enhanced the known challenges for these various folks, children, families, and our BIPOC community. I truly believe we can do that work because we've got the ultimate motivator now. We know these folks are struggling. It would be a really awful shame and adding to a catastrophic moment in our lives if we didn't attend to that.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, your insight. We've heard it from Dr. Lee, on the perspectives. She's an expert at Northwestern University, and she shared with her insight on homeschooling, COVID-19, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. We thank you for being on the Perspectives and sharing your insight, and thank you for the work that you're doing in counselor education and mental health care. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining the Perspectives with Dr. Beverly Smith and the American Mental Health Counseling Association. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the American Mental Health Counselors Association podcast with President and Interim CEO/ED, Dr. Beverly Smith. We hope you will join us for the next episode to connect and hear the perspectives from experts and the organization that exclusively represent clinical mental health counselors. Be well.